Hello and welcome to the Beginning of Wisdom Live. It's good to be here. I am here once again with my wife, Nikki.
Hi guys, we are so excited for tonight's show.
Yeah, my name's Andrew Schumacher. This is Nikki Schumacher. We are going to be talking about a really interesting conversation that happened. It actually happened a few weeks ago in May, but then it was released online on the 31st, and it's between Jeff Durbin of Apologia Studios and Apologia Church and Andy Stanley of North Point Community Church, and just a conversation they had really based on some things that have been going on lately with things Andy has said starting about a year ago.
But before we get into that, if you guys would like to support the channel, how can they find ways to do that?
So you can support the channel by subscribing on Subscribestar. We've got a link in the description. Also, we have some Amazon affiliate links. Got some books that I like in there, as well as the gear that I use for this show. And if you're going to get it something there anyway, if you follow those links, it gives us a little bit to help support the show. And we just appreciate you guys so much.
And the biggest thing you guys can do is like, subscribe, and share. Especially if you know someone who's struggling with this topic. Share. You never know who you might help.
Yeah. So today's show is going to be... so the conversation between Andy and Jeff have a lot to do with the Old Testament. What I felt we had time to discuss tonight and what was really relevant to this audience, I know, is just their conversation on the Old Testament law specifically, and how that relates to us as Christians. I will say sort of what I think as far as each man and how they approach it. Just my overall take, I guess, on what they have to say. I think that for Andy Stanley, he comes from it really with an sort of idiosyncratic position. It's a very interesting one, and
very interesting.
And that position really it creates a hard line, such a hard line as we'll see hopefully in some of these clips, that between the Old and New Testament, that he believes, that we don't even really need to worry too much about the Old Testament, at least as it comes to apologetics and as it comes to what we defend and things like that.
I will say this discussion clarified for me what Andy Stanley's position actually is on this topic. Mm-hmm. I had heard a lot of things online, and I was like, I heard all kinds of things. So this really clarified it for me what he actually believes. Right,
and helped me a lot too to kind of get a clearer picture. And so I think where Andy Stanley's coming from, he creates this hard distinction, really from an apologetic motivation, but it, and so Old Covenant, New Covenant, but then he takes that to sort of a huge extreme, as we'll kind of see in some of the clips. And then Jeff Durbin's position is sort of in some ways the polar opposite. Jeff Durbin describes himself as a theonomist, and a theonomist, as we talked about on the show, is somebody who believes the Old Testament law is still applicable today, but not the way that they say in the Hebrew Roots movement, but rather that it does have new expression in the New Covenant, but that we should not. But there's an assumption of continuity. So whereas Andy Stanley comes from an assumption of discontinuity, Old Covenant, New Covenant, these are totally separate. Jeff Durbin comes from an assumption of continuity, but says that the new interprets the old to where it has different expression. Where I think, Jeff Durbin's position, I don't think it necessarily falls short. As you'll see, he doesn't come across, he doesn't come to the conclusions that those in the Hebrew Roots movement come to. But I think that some of what he says could be clarified. I think he's not actually very familiar with Hebrew Roots arguments specifically. I think he's familiar with the position. He actually explicitly denies the position at several points in the video. but I don't think he's familiar so much with the way they argue, because sometimes the way he argues sounds like the way they argue. So it's a very interesting conversation, and so I'm excited to kind of get into it.
Very interesting. As someone who struggled with, I guess when we came across the Hebrew Roots movement, it forced me to clarify my position on the Old Testament and being very free in Christ, and not realizing that I had bound myself to the law more than I thought I was. And so hearing Durbin's perspective challenges me again to clarify even more. Yeah. Because to someone struggling who maybe just came out of the Hebrew Roots movement, his view, if you don't listen to him clarify in its entirety, could be kind of scary. Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense. So that was interesting for me to wrestle with, I guess, in this conversation.
Yeah, totally. So and it was for me too. I mean, it's definitely some good stuff to wrestle with, and I would recommend as you're, that you watch the interview or watch the discussion. They're both together on a radio show that someone else is hosting. So, but watch that. The link is in the description to see that. So when you're done with this, if you want to see it all in its entirety, you can certainly do that. What we're going to focus on, I'm going to have a couple of clips that come from earlier in the conversation. So it's about an hour and a half video. It's really the last 20 minutes that they get into talking about the law specifically. Most of the rest of it is talking just about Old Testament, New Testament, not just not really about commandments, but about just how do we take the Old Testament, how do we put the scriptures versus, from Andy Stanley's position, he believes that when it comes to what we know, we start with the resurrection and then we work our way backwards. Jesus was resurrected, therefore we can trust what he says. He says the Bible is true, therefore we can trust the Bible. So that's his way of approaching things. So he does believe, and he affirms that he believes the whole Bible is the Word of God. But he just kind of, I don't know, comes at it a way that makes a lot of people very nervous. Whereas Jeff Durbin's position is that it's the Word of the living God, you trust it because God said it, and that's the foundation, and it gives meaning to the resurrection and all of that. So that's what most of the conversation is back and forth about, those kinds of things. But then in the last 20 minutes, they really get into the law, and that's what I want to focus on, just because I know, my audience and what we've talked about as far as all the Hebrew Roots stuff. So I think this is also very important because even some Hebrew Roots folks that I follow are already responding to it. There's actually a 2-part video out right now by a guy named Dr. Al Garza, who I follow and have gotten learned some good things from, especially around the Trinity. But he's responding to it, and and I haven't got a chance to watch his video, so I won't comment on it. But I know he's in that movement, believes in the Hebrew Roots movement. So just it's getting noticed. So I want to definitely spend some time with it. So the first clip I want to do is just sort of where it gets, where they start this conversation. So the host, Justin Brierley, he brings up Jesus' words about the law in Matthew 5, and what's interesting about this first clip is he talks about how he talks about how Jesus in Matthew 5 discusses the law, but then he specifically asks Andy Stanley to how he distinguishes between the law and the whole Old Testament. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a very interesting clip to look at. Bear with me one moment. I think I need to actually get it all connected here. Yes, I do.
Hi, Audrey.
Okay, there we go. And
Hi, Geneva Pilgrim. Just take a moment to say
yes, of course.
Hi, Marcia.
Totally. Okay, let's go ahead and we will bring this stuff in here. Gives me a moment. Okay, there we go. And let play.
Fulfill it.
Right.
So to what extent, is what you have in your mind that idea that the law is no longer binding on Christians today, that it's obsolete in that sense? Because a lot of people, I think, have then assumed you're also saying that about the Old Testament. The Old Testament is somehow an old thing, it's obsolete, that we don't kind of need to worry about or think about it anymore.
Well, the word obsolete is, as you know, is not original with me. So who would say that? Only the author of Hebrews. But anyway, and he meant something by that, and it's pretty clear. The challenging thing for most Christians is they don't make a distinction, and it's preachers' fault, a distinction between the Sinai covenant and the Old Testament. The Old Testament includes more than the Sinai covenant, but from the Sinai covenant forward to Malachi, everything's happening within that I will, if you will, relationship between God and Israel, other than Jonah, other than some other literature. So, but no, God made a covenant with Israel. You can read it in Exodus, and we weren't there, and it wasn't a covenant with me, and it wasn't a covenant with you. We're blessed by God's covenant with Abraham through the nation of Israel. God would bring about Messiah, and we've all been blessed through him. So the differentiator to me is the old covenant being the Sinai covenant, and the new covenant established by Jesus. And we've been invited to be included in the new covenant thanks to the God's providential work from the time of Abraham on. So to me, again, it's just very sequential. It's very simple. And
to what extent, in your view, Andy, does that make some of the Old Testament laws, like, for instance, the Ten Commandments, irrelevant?
Yeah.
Because you say that.
Here's the thing.
Yeah.
Everybody agrees that we don't keep the Sinai covenant in total. Everybody agrees with that. Most of it's illegal in the United States, the UK, and Canada. Not most of it, but much of it. So then we're down to what do we leave in and what do we leave out? What do we leave in? What do we leave out? And that's where the disagreement is. And there's groups that believe we can have categories: the moral law, the ceremonial law, the civil law. And then there's others that say, no, it's just one. We don't get the privilege of slicing and dicing. This was God's covenant with the nation of Israel. And we're not Israel, and we have a new covenant. So,
All right, so I'll jump in there. So basically, what we see him saying is, God made a covenant with Israel. When he talks about slicing and dicing, looking at different types of law, he's saying we really just can't do that. It's sort of an all or nothing thing. And I'm sympathetic to that. I mean, I understand where folks come on that, and I feel... it's funny. There are areas that Andy Stanley, where things he says that I'm like tracking. I understand what he's saying. That it's obvious, and we're gonna, as we get through some of these clips, it becomes obvious, I think, that that there are things Andy's saying that make sense, and then as we hear from Jeff Durbin, there are things Jeff Durbin says that make sense, and I think the error and this is just sort of the way that I see both men, is that Andy Stanley has some good premises. So it's like he's making an argument. He says, well, this covenant's with Israel. Well, yes, it is. There's certain parts of the law that we can't do now. I mean, that no one would do now. Things, and it's not because it was wrong then. It's just it doesn't work except in a theocratic society with God at its head, in that culture. And I'll talk a little bit in more detail about that. But, there are things that make sense about that. On the other hand, you have Jeff Durbin, who I think comes to correct conclusions, and even I think gets there in good ways, but maybe hasn't thought through all the implications of how he got there. To the point where if he were arguing with someone, I think in the Hebrew Roots movement, he might not quite know how to respond.
I would have been exactly there because I would have never known to clarify my views on some of these things had we not been dealing with Hebrew Roots for the last year or so, had I not come across Philia Ministries channel, had I not met all these gospel defenders online. Way to go, you guys. I'm so proud of you. there is this group of people that we've met online that are literally pulling people out of the Hebrew Roots movement and pulling them out of bondage to the law. And had I not met these people, I might not have had to clarify my position the way that I have.
Yeah. And I think that's how it works. I mean, it worked that way in the early centuries of the church. But
I'm very comfortable with
Trinity,
Jeff Durbin's teaching on the matter. As far as it doesn't seem like he's really had to deal with Hebrew roots like we have, but the application and how he's going to lead his congregation, I am fully comfortable with.
Yeah. So I want to look now. So we've kind of heard Andy Stanley's position. I want to go to Jeff Durbin's statements to really, to kind of give you a flavor for where he's coming from on all this stuff, specifically related to the law. And if you're familiar with all that we've talked about on this channel, you're gonna be interested in this. So okay, really good. So here is some of what Jeff Durbin talks about, as and remember, in this conversation he's defending against the idea that we don't have to even think about the Old Testament. There are things that were said earlier by Andy Stanley in the conversation where he believes that we tether our belief to an event, the resurrection, not a book. So Andy Stanley makes this dichotomy, this hard distinction between depending on the resurrection and depending on the text. And I think that's simply unnecessary, but he's doing that for some apologetic reasons. But then so Jeff Durbin's has to go back all the way to the point of saying, well, look, here's what the Bible says, we tie it to the text. So that's kind of where he's coming from. But let's go ahead and listen to this first clip here. So let me bring that up.
And I'll get to some of those points that Andy made there in terms of why would you want to go back to these commandments when now we have the Spirit of God. I think that's exactly the point, though, is that the promises in the Old Testament about the coming kingdom of the Messiah, about Christ coming to bring salvation to the world, were not just about forgiveness and salvation. There were bigger promises to that, and they were promises not to the Jews, not just to the Jews, but to the world. Those promises are for us. And if we make it disjunctive and we say, well, those are all just, from Sinai and they're just to the Jews, they're not to us, then we actually lose the benefits of the promises of the empowering of the Spirit of God to keep the law that are contained in those very books. Just a couple examples. We don't have a lot of time to do them all today. Jeremiah 31:31, the promise there before it even gets to forgiveness and salvation is that God says he's going to do something new, not like he did before. And this is the new thing. Not he's going to dissolve the law, do away with the law. He says he's going to put his Torah, his law, within them now. He's going to write it now, not on stone tablets outside the people of God, but now he's going to write that law, the law, within the people of God, and they would be careful to obey it because now they actually relate to God in a new way.
All right, so I want to pause right here because he's talking about the law. So this is, like I said before, this is where it sounds like, if you've studied Hebrew roots at all, when they talk about the new covenant, they're going to say, well, it's God writes the law in our hearts. That's what makes it new. It's not that it's getting rid of the law. It's the law, right? So now, if you don't know the rest of what Jeff says, you're going to wonder, well, how does he deal with like everything? I mean, does he not eat pork? Does he, keep the seventh day Sabbath? Does he
how do you figure it out?
Try to keep the feasts? Does he do all those things? What's going on? I mean, he's got a beard, right? Is he doing that because of the law?
I have heard people from his congregations call Sunday the Sabbath. We practice the Sabbath, and it's a sin to do certain things on the Sabbath. Not to say that his views are showing all of the views of his congregants, but
right. But yeah, I mean, definitely there are a lot of people from that theonomic tradition, theonomy, that they consider this. They say it's Sunday now. That Jesus' resurrection changed things. It has a new expression.
Well, see, I would
but
say
it's still
it
the same
changed
thing.
things.
Yeah.
And Jesus is my Sabbath.
Right.
That's what I would say.
That is what I would say.
But I don't think they're like too far off to where it's like, oh my gosh.
Right. So, he's coming at it. And he's saying that law is written on our hearts. And then I want to do another clip here, just a touch later. And we'll hear some other things he talks about, just from some different prophets about what it says about the Torah and things like that.
Into the world is the law itself is going to go forth from the people of God. Isaiah 42 is another critical promise about the Messiah, about him coming to bring not just salvation, but establishing justice on the earth. And then it says that the coastlands wait for his Torah, his law. Ezekiel 36 is, I think, the answer to what Andy is asking for in terms of spirit-filled, spirit-empowered obedience to God himself. But it's interesting because Ezekiel 36 talks about sprinkling clean water on us, cleansing us from our idols. Praise God for that. And it says that he removes a heart of stone and gives a heart of flesh, and he puts a spirit within people and causes them, he says, to observe his statutes. Well, which statutes is Ezekiel referring to? Well, the constituent element, again, there is the law of God is part and parcel to what God is going to do that's new in the new covenant, is we're going to relate to God in a new way. Not that the law is thrown away. The law now is within us, and we're empowered by God's Spirit to bear fruit to God in obedience to that law. But this is critical. There's a reference point here that's being missed. When we say the 10 Commandments are irrelevant, we're disagreeing with the apostles who quote from it repeatedly. When we say that the law of God is no longer obligatory towards us today, I think that we're violating what is so clearly taught in the New Testament. And I'll just give you a couple examples. Maybe you can respond to some of these, Andy. When you say that we're no longer accountable to the 10 Commandments, you're not accountable to the Jewish law. We're done with that. God has done something new. I would say, well, tell that to the Apostle Paul in Ephesians 6, verses 1 through 2, where he just assumes the continuity of children obey your parents in the Lord, honor your father and your mother. Now, he doesn't do it by saying, now, brothers and sisters, we know that this is obsolete and done away with, and we're no longer obligated to that law. We're not under that law. He just assumes the continuity of that law within the new covenant. And by the way, that's post-cross, post-resurrection, and post-ascension. He doesn't just assume the 10 Commandments. He assumes animal husbandry laws. In 1 Corinthians 9:8, after the resurrection, he says, do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? This is interesting, timing-wise, does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake. What was? Animal husbandry laws, how to treat things that are laboring for you. And he assumes the continuity within the new covenant of that principle within animal husbandry laws. He does it with judicial law in 1 Timothy 5:19. He says, don't receive an accusation against an elder unless it's on the basis of 2 to 3 witnesses. That's judicial law. He assumes the continuity of the rightness of the death penalty in judicial proceedings in Acts 25:11 by saying, if I've committed anything for which I deserve to die, he says, I do not seek to escape death. He does it even with, and I'll end with this one, keeping the festival in 1 Corinthians 5:8. He doesn't say, now go back to the shadows, go back to the dress rehearsal, go back to the training wheels. He says, because of Christ, this is how you now.
Okay, I want to jump in here because this is all a good presentation, but I want us to see this. I think, because a lot of times, people who are, we're always looking, and I think this is very important. We're always looking. I think Andy Stanley's guilty of this, looking for just sort of a silver bullet that's going to just make everything easy.
Yeah.
Make Scripture just be easy on us. God is, we've talked about the Trinity. God is not simple. Not simple in terms of being understood. Yeah. I mean, God is, he's not someone that, I mean, think about how complicated people are, and God made people.
The gospel smells stinky to those who it offends.
Yeah, to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the fragrance of life. So there's a lot of complexity here. And what I want us to see, especially those of us who, I'm sure we have people watching who come from the Hebrew roots perspective, and we've got people who are, actively, trying to refute that perspective. And what I want us to see is that from the Hebrew roots perspective, it is not so simple as to just say, well, the easy answer is, well, yeah, just keep all the laws. I mean, if it's physically possible for you to do so, do it.
And I mean, even a few years ago, and I fully was saved. I believed in Jesus for my salvation by grace through faith. But I even was confused as to what's a law and what's wisdom. Like, I looked at the book of Proverbs and I thought, it says, don't be in debt. And I thought that was a law, and it's a sin to be in debt. We don't have a car payment. We don't have a house payment. And so I would ask the people that are, thinking you have to follow the whole law and not eat pork or whatever, if they have a house payment, if they have a car payment.
Right.
And realizing that, oh gosh, I listened to an amazing podcast today by the Bible Project guys, Mackey, the last name is Mackey. Yeah, and they actually, you guys should listen to it. They addressed the law, and are we bound to the law? And just realizing that, just like in any narrative, at the beginning of the story, you get to know the character, and then at the end of the story, you get to know the character more. But that character, God, he doesn't change. You just get to know him more, and you get to know more of the story. And it doesn't mean that the whole beginning of the story doesn't even matter. Like, I don't see how Andy Stanley can say, oh, we don't even need the beginning of the story.
Right.
Like, it wouldn't make complete sense without it.
Right. Yeah. And so, if and there's a lot of there's one way of looking at it, and I think that has a lot of merit, and that is to see the fact that humanity, and not everyone would agree with this, human nature doesn't really change over time, but there seems to be, as they're kind of alluding to, there seems to be a progression, and the progression's in us as humanity, that we began. He allows
himself to change his mind on things depending on what we're doing.
Yeah, so we change and mature. You see it in the nation of Israel. When God first gives them the law, they're idolaters, and they're idolaters right from Mount Sinai, and on, and you see it through the Samuel and Kings and everything. But by the time they go into captivity and come back, and we get to the New Testament, they're not idolaters anymore. They still have problems. There's still things that Jesus is correcting with people like the Pharisees and stuff. But
you didn't see him bowing down to like chunks of gold anymore.
No, they're done with that. They're finished with that.
Well, we don't do that in America exactly either. We have different idols.
Right.
But
so there's definitely some merit to that sort of narrative arc. But the thing I want us to get from what Jeff Durbin's saying here is that, Paul says, this was written, the animal husbandry laws, as he says, don't muzzle the ox, is written for us.
There is wisdom
so it isn't, we don't just kick it out.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, as you heard him begin to talk about, I'm going to back it up just a little bit to let him kind of develop this thought. But when he's talking about the feast, he's talking about how we now sort of look at the feast, and it's not about it's not about, you know, the specific, you know, activities. It's about, you know, what's in our hearts. So let me go ahead and get this reset. Okay.
He does it even with, and I'll end with this one, keeping the festival. In 1 Corinthians 5:8, he doesn't say, now go back to the shadows, go back to the dress rehearsal, go back to the training wheels. He says, because of Christ, this is how you now to view the festival. Let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. What we were supposed to see according to the New Testament, and the New Testament gives us the interpretation. We're supposed to assume the continuity of God's law, unless, of course, the lawgiver gives us divine revelation of how we're supposed to see it. Mm-hmm. We're supposed to see now that those shadows, those training wheels are fulfilled in Jesus, and you're to see it in a new way. But he doesn't say, so throw it out, it's over with. That's why we still have a priest today. That's why we still have a temple today. Okay. That's why we still have a sacrifice today, but now we have it in its fulfilled non-dress rehearsal way, but it's assumed throughout the New Testament.
So here we've got the sort of his full position. This is where Jeff is explaining why. Well, I don't know if he's thinking about Hebrew roots or not at all, but he's explaining how it is in terms of just his doctrine, that he's not saying that we just go back and do everything as the law says. I've heard him say in another talk he gave, you know, we don't just copy and paste, you know, the Old Testament law into the New Covenant. Rather, as he said, you know, that was a dress rehearsal. That was, you know, as the, you know, Book of Hebrews says, that those were types and shadows. So that's where, now this is where I agree 100% with what he's saying. But where I see some need for clarity, because what he says, it says throughout the New Testament, and I believe it does teach some things in certain places for sure, where laws are specifically changed or cast in a new light or things like that. And I could give several examples. Of course, Hebrew roots folks have their answers to these, but I think they're valid. You know, when Jesus is talking about what goes into a man makes him clean, not, or what comes out of a man makes him clean or unclean, not what goes in. And the narrator says, and by this Jesus declared all foods clean. The fact is that you know, the only answer that I've ever heard from anyone in the Hebrew roots movement to that is, well, all of the translations, English translations before the King James didn't have that, and I'm like, okay, cool, but it wasn't written in English; it was written in Greek, and I don't know why. Whatever English translations, maybe they didn't have access to something, but really, that's actually a verse with no textual variance. I mean, every Greek text we have says that. So Jesus clearly said that. And Paul clearly, as I've said on other shows and in other videos, you know, he clearly differentiates circumcision from something, you know, as something that Gentiles are not obligated to do. There's never a single verse that says Gentiles go be circumcised, not one. And so any teaching that says, oh, you get circumcised in your heart first and then you go do it physically, well, never happens once in Scripture, never commanded once. In fact, he says just the opposite. He says if you are not circumcised, don't become circumcised. So that's the exact opposite. So there are definitely, like Jeff is saying, there are definitely times where God talks, you know, where through the apostles or through Jesus has laws being specifically talked about as being changed. I want to take a moment here to, while I'm remembering, to let you know, as always, to put questions in the chat. Maybe you know, Nikki's in the chat right now, and maybe she's already said that. But I do want to remind you guys to definitely put those things in there. We're going to be getting kind of deep with some stuff, hopefully today, if I have time. I'm trying to blast through this stuff as quick as I can as far as the video, to get to kind of where I think Jeff can go to create a consistent sort of backdrop, because I think the backdrop for those changes and a consistent basis for those things actually comes from the law itself. It comes from the Torah. It's right there in there. So, but first I want to kind of move forward in what we're talking about. We're going to go back to some of the things that Andy Stanley says again, and we will. So we'll talk about that for a bit here. So find where I'm at. Okay.
Where did we get permission to slice and dice the Sinai covenant? And we're going to keep the 10 commandments, but we're not going to keep the penalties that go with those commandments. And I mean, nobody lives that way. And if you want to, that is an approach to the New Testament. There's a much simpler approach. Jesus established a new covenant. He said, here's your marching orders. Here are the terms and conditions. You are to love others, not the way you choose to love. You are to love as I have loved you. This is written in your heart. You don't even have to commit it to memory.
So first of all, I just want to mention there, he mentions again, slicing and dicing. That's how he sees any position. So he's coming from a position really in some ways similar to the Hebrew roots position, in that the law is a whole. You can't take some of it to be applicable in some ways and others to be applicable in other ways. It's sort of a whole, and his response is, so we chuck it because we're now in a new covenant. We have everything we need in the New Testament, is sort of his position. So I just want to make that little point there.
You just memorize it. You are to love as I have loved you. The next day, he put on a demonstration of love that, took his breath away, and rose from the dead, and the church has been going ever since. And it's so interesting that he brought up the Ephesians passage, because everybody brings up the Ephesians passage, love, children, obey your parents. It's the only one they bring up that's specific from the 10 Commandments, because it's really the only one that seems to be taken. But it is not the basis of his argument. The basis of his argument is to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. That's the theme of that passage. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Or at the beginning of the chapter, walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved and gave himself for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. And then everything that flows from those thematic verses are simply applications. And he references the Old Testament law, but not as an authority, but as an application of submit yourself to God out of reverence, submit yourself to one another out of reverence for Christ. So again, we can talk all day long about the sequencing of Scripture and how to interpret Scripture. And if a Christian wants to figure out how to integrate the Sinai covenant into the new covenant, knock yourself out. But the other thing that, your listeners either know or should know is that in the first century Jews felt no compulsion to abandon the Sinai covenant. It was still their covenant. So of course they lived it out. I mean, throughout Acts, we find them going to the temple. It meant something different. They were trying to figure out, how do I integrate my newfound faith with my previous way of life. But yeah, in fact, Messianic Jews, that's the point of being a Messianic Jew. They still embrace a version of the Sinai covenant. Well, of course they should. They're Jewish. It just never included me to begin with. So again, that's just a different way of seeing all that. But
so what I want to point out, the reason I shared this particular section is that he's talking about what's the motivation, and Jeff's actually going to come back with some really important points here. But at the beginning of that, he said we don't do it because it's written in the law. We do it out of reverence for Christ, or because Christ is our example. And he's like, that's all we really need. And if you want to add it, if you want to do that, knock yourself out. He makes a point I think is very important in these conversations to realize, and that is that in the New Testament, that we're looking at Jewish people doing Jewish things. We're not looking at Gentile people. When we see people like Paul doing things that are found in the law, they never ever condemn Jews for keeping the law, and that's important to remember. It isn't the Hebrew roots movement isn't wrong because they think, that because the truth is we're just not supposed to, that nobody should do, or we should not keep anything in there, or that it's wrong to keep a 7th-day Sabbath or to eat kosher or things like that. It's not wrong to do those things. And it's, when Paul is accused of things and when Stephen's accused, they're not accused of teaching Gentiles or, not teaching Gentiles the law or teaching Gentiles not to do it. There's not really Gentiles involved during those times of accusation. What's they're being accused of, which is wrong, is that to teach Jews not to keep the law anymore. And there's a difference. I mean, they were free to continue to keep doing things that were in the law up until the end of the existence of the temple. They could do whatever they wanted, that was in the law. But then the temple gets destroyed. They can no longer do any sacrifices. And I believe that's providential. I think that's why that it happened, because we were entering into a new era, a new age, a Christian age. But I think it's important to realize what he's saying there is that, I'm not a Jew. I was never a part of that covenant. I don't have to be a part of that covenant. I'm in a new covenant, and I don't think that's wrong. Again, I think he makes some leaps that are wrong. But it's interesting, though, again, how when he's pointing out the stuff about specifically, it's just about Jews, that kind of thing, or out of reference for Christ. It's interesting how Jeff Durbin responds, because he points out that it is, again, a little more complex than just that. Let's see, 25. Let me get to that spot real quick. Almost there. Sorry about this. Just have to... Oh, I missed it. It's hard queuing up this many clips. Okay, here we go.
You're going to see it again different from what I just quoted from in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 8, even down to something that can be seen as so irrelevant to Christians today when we read that. Animal husbandry laws. He says this, "Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say it the same?" Then he quotes the law, and he says, "Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It is written for our sake, not on human authority." On what? God's authority. And so I think that it's important to recognize that again, 10 Commandments are quoted with the assumption of continuity, but you're supposed to see it now in a spirit-filled new covenant way. And
That's my point.
And if somebody says, well, how are we supposed to know that? I would say the New Testament gives you divine revelation on how you're supposed to view these things. Judicial law is assumed as continuous, the death penalty, festivals, all of that. And so and this is the final thing I'll say, and that this is I think so critical. In Ephesians chapter 2, the Apostle Paul is addressing the issue of the holiness code. Like, what are we supposed to keep? How come not the dietary laws, the holiness code? And the answer is so clear from the New Testament. It's all throughout. Those were dress rehearsals. Those were training wheels. Those don't apply anymore because now we have the substance, who is Christ, and now we're filled with the Spirit of God. But what's interesting here is, as Paul's addressing that very issue in Ephesians chapter 2 about the holiness code and all the rest, and throughout, he says in Ephesians 2:11, "Therefore remember that at one time you Gentiles in the flesh, called uncircumcision by what is called the circumcision, which is made in the flesh by hands. Remember," and this is critical here, guys, "that you were at the same time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the," he says this, "covenants, plural, of promise, singular, having no hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one and broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances." And so what Paul does there is he says that
You just made my point.
Well, actually, I haven't. I've made the opposite point, because what he says is that now you were once strangers to these covenants, plural, of promise. You were strangers to the commonwealth of Israel, but now you've brought near to what? To the commonwealth of Israel, to the covenants, plural, of promise. If we've been brought near to the covenants of promise, then we've been brought near not just to the Abrahamic covenant, Andy, but to the blessings of what God gave to Moses, to the blessings of the Davidic covenant. In Christ, we've been brought near to the blessings of all those covenants,
including the land, right?
And this is what I would say. Well, now the Bible teaches us by divine revelation that promise is actually the whole world, not just the land. That's what the Bible teaches us. But it also says this, and this is where I'll end, and this is something I encourage everyone to go read. Deuteronomy chapter 4 does not see the law of God the way that Andy describes it, merely as sort of like, law and harsh and just, it's just a temporary covenant kind of a thing. It says that the nations were supposed to see this law and say, what kind of nation is this that has a God so near to it as this, and has rules and statutes, a law so righteous as this law? The law of God was supposed to be seen as a blessing to the world. It was justice and righteousness and goodness that the world can look in it and say, what kind of God is this that has a law so perfect as this?
Yep.
I think when we cast that away, I think we lose the benefits that are promised in Jeremiah 31, Isaiah 2, Isaiah 42, and Ezekiel 36.
Okay,
All right, so that's really the end of the conversation there. So there are a few earlier things I wanted to bring up, but I knew they would be probably not have time for them. So where I want to go right now is to kind of give you, because what you heard from Jeff there, he's pointing out it's not just it's not just the 10 Commandments that still matter. It's not just just the moral law. You heard him say that he believes in the continuity of the civil law, and if you listen to me, you may have heard me say that's probably an accurate statement, and it's because it's actually correct and biblical to make distinctions in the law and to understand what underlies the different laws. So where I want to shift here before we go to audience questions is I want to give you a quick rundown of just kind of how I make these distinctions, where I think they come from in the Bible. We'll probably go a little long tonight. Just a little. But I won't have time to get into a lot of the full details. But I want to direct you at this point to my website, where I have I've put I've been doing a set of articles on the Hebrew Roots movement, and in those articles, really talking about how do we understand the law from the perspective of the Torah itself, from the Old Testament. What can we glean from there? If you go to the website, and let me go ahead and pull it up here and kind of show it to you. So this is at the website. You can see beginningwisdom.org. In the Hebrew Roots section, which is at the top of the screen, or if you're on mobile on a phone, I believe you hit the little 3 lines and it comes in from the side. But you click that Hebrew Roots button and you get this. If you scroll down a bit, you'll come to this Answering Hebrew Roots blog series. And there's a lot of stuff in here, but how to recognize distinctions in the law, and it kind of goes through what I've seen in my study of the Torah. But what I want you to kind of focus on here are these last 4 articles that are in there right now: the moral law, the civil law, and religious laws, part 1 and 2. So just to give you the quick rundown, what we see in the moral law is, and the reason why there's a distinction, well, it's a little easier to start with the civil law. So the civil law, the reason there's a distinction is the civil law is not about like thou shalt not. It's really just saying, if such and such happens, here's how you deal with it. So you've got and it could be a sin issue, it could be a cleanliness issue. It's not always sin, but it's still law. It's still, if this happens, do this. And and this is where I think, we would have a much more just society. There is one example of, there's a couple times in the law where it says an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, that kind of stuff. One of those talks about it's connected to bearing false witness. And that is that, if someone brings, an accusation before basically the court, the elders, and it's found that they're lying, then the civil law states, do unto them what would have been done had the person they're accusing been found guilty. And it says eye for eye, tooth for tooth, life for life. Think about that for a moment in our sue-happy society and our accusation-happy society, where people accuse people of all kinds of terrible things. Well, they do that because they know there's no consequence to them, even if they're lying. Our society doesn't have a law like this. And how much more just would our society be if it did? If you accuse someone and you were found to be lying, that person, or that whatever punishment would have been given to them is now given to you, I guarantee it would create a much more just society. So I I think that's great. So I think, and when it comes to civil law, I mean, they had death penalty for rape and kidnapping. How much less rape and kidnapping would we have if we had such a law?
I used to live in China,
yeah.
And
where they also have death penalty.
Yeah. Well, so
yeah.
I asked some friends. So if you get caught murdering in China, will you die? And my friend was like, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I was like, if you get caught raping, will you die? And my friend was like, probably.
Mm-hmm.
Probably. And guess what? The whole time I was there was like zero.
Yeah.
There was a lot of theft there,
mm-hmm.
a lot of petty crime,
mm-hmm.
and obviously there was more violent crime out in rural areas where people can't get caught. But
mm-hmm.
as far as like right in the city, you could walk as a female at 2 a.m.
Yeah. You're
totally safe.
Yeah. So the civil law. So that's kind of what that article's about, because it's like, there's some good continuity here, but there's also stuff that doesn't really work today. In terms of, part of the civil law is like there's always sacrifices where mm-hmm. you have to physically go to the temple and kill an animal, and God never allowed for there to be multiple temples in multiple countries. Like if we were really keeping that law as written today, mm-hmm. every person, every country who ever committed a crime would have to travel to Jerusalem and slaughter an animal, to keep that law.
It's really sad if we don't see that Jesus was the
yeah.
one for all
right.
sacrifice.
Right. But here's where I want to point out. So the two parts here, religious laws, and I'll bring this back up here. So the part 1 talks about the different ways laws are described. Which laws are religious? So how can we tell a religious law? And there's a list here of just some of the most popular ones among the Hebrew Roots movement: dietary laws, feasts and appointed times, Sabbath, tzitzits, fabrics and hair, clothing, grooming regulations, Hebrew names, sacred names, modern holidays, circumcision, things like that. These are sort of the hot button issues that you hear a lot about. And I go over what is and isn't said about a lot of these in these articles. And what I found, just surveying them, is that there's a common thread, and I think this is where some real consistent exegesis can be done. And that is, I found that there's definitely a common thread on the fact that these laws always talk in some way about distinguishing Israel from their neighbors. It's done in a couple different ways. It could say, do this because I want you to remember that I brought you out of the land of Egypt. God didn't bring the other nations out of the land of Egypt. He brought Israel out of the land of Egypt. So he's not giving that law
I've never been
to
to
those.
Egypt.
He's not giving that law to Assyria because the reason he's giving the law is so that Israel will remember that he brought them out of the land of Egypt. So from the beginning, these laws are not intended for every person to keep and obey as they're written. They are intended for Israel to keep and obey, in that time. So that's, I think, and you see that thread, you see a very common thread with a lot of them, especially with the feast days. Every single feast involves sacrifices. And there was always, as soon as there was an ark and a tabernacle, and that became the one place where sacrifices were authorized to be given to happen. That place moved around with Israel when they were in the wilderness, but as soon as they came into the land and they were established, that's where it stayed. And when the temple was built and the ark was brought into the temple, that's where it was. And so there was always only the one place to offer the sacrifices. So that meant, and you see it in the New Testament, people traveling to Jerusalem for the feast because they had to keep the feast. And so when those in the Hebrew roots movement today say we have to keep the feasts, well, we can't. Those same Hebrew roots movement folks, when they say, well, we don't stone a rebellious son today because you have to have a priesthood and elders and authorities, to make that happen and make that righteous, they still say, oh, but we still keep the feast. Well, you can't have it both ways. And the scriptures, even in the Torah, give us indications as to why what Jeff is saying is true, that these are the training wheels. These are the types and shadows, the things that lead us to Christ. And once we have Christ, then we see them all in a new light. The things that are in the moral law, the reason they continue is not because, God made this distinction in the Old Testament where, at the time of the Old Testament, at the time of this covenant, of Mosaic covenant, it's all moral law. If you don't do it, you're sinning. So it's all moral at the time. But some laws have an underlying sense of justice and mercy and things like that. And that's why Jesus says, to the Pharisees, you've abandoned the weightier matters of the law. You've abandoned justice and mercy. So there's a distinction there as well. So I think that the distinctions are right there in the text, and we can't argue that they aren't. So that's why I think Andy Stanley's wrong. He's wrong that when he characterizes it as slicing and dicing and you're just trying to integrate things and get creative. He's wrong because the scriptures themselves are clear. If one of the things that was brought up, I remember when Andy Stanley first started talking about not being tethered to a book and not being tied to the scriptures and things like that, and especially the Old Testament. One of the things I heard Jeff Durbin say, which he didn't say in this interview, but he has said, is, well, how do you know certain types of sexual sin are wrong? How do you know bestiality is wrong? Because the New Testament doesn't address it. The New Testament doesn't address every kind of sexual sin that Leviticus does. So how do you know that those ones in Leviticus that aren't addressed in the New Testament are wrong? Well, because Jesus and the apostles taught, abstain from sexual immorality. They only had to say sexual immorality, and everybody knew, well, okay, we know the sections of God's law that talk about sexual immorality, and so we should abstain from all of those because those are moral law and those have continuity that doesn't really need to change. They're not religious in nature. God doesn't say about those laws the same thing he says about the religious laws, that I give you this because I want you to remember that I'm your God and distinguish you from the other nations. He doesn't do that with every law. He only does it with those religious laws. So I hope that gives some background. I hope that you check those articles out if you have questions and things like that. One thing I would love to do, and I actually did reach out to Apologia to try to get connected up with Jeff Durbin. He's super busy. I did not expect anything before this show.
You can't blame a man for trying.
Yeah, but I hope that at some point somebody who knows him lets him know about this, and he gets a chance to see it, and we get a chance to have a conversation, because I think he has a very his position is basically correct. I think that it could be enhanced a little bit, so that if he does, have interactions with Hebrew roots people, and he probably already has, but he's got so many other important things he's doing that they don't come out in his content. But if we had that conversation, I think that would help to build us both up, and it would be really awesome. So, maybe it'll happen someday, maybe not. But
do I have time for a couple
yes,
questions? So
we're right about at time, but like I said, we'll go a little bit over, so let's go ahead and do some questions.
Okay, Nicole Splatter or Splater, I'm sorry, let me know in the chat if I'm butchering your name. Would like to know, is Jeff Durbin a preterist? Do you know?
He is a partial preterist. So
that's what I was thinking.
What that means?
He's not a hyper preterist.
No. So there is a I believe heretical, like if you believe it, you're like
Woo!
Not even Christian,
Mm-hmm.
or dang near close. There's a hyper-preterism or full preterism, which basically believes literally everything that is prophesied in the New Testament about Jesus returning has already happened. We are not expecting anything, and I think that's definitely false. Partial preterism would take many of the prophecies, but not all of them, to be specific to things like the destruction of Jerusalem. So especially the Olivet Discourse, when Jesus talks about some in this generation will not pass away before they see the Son of Man coming in his glory. That what he's talking about isn't the second coming that we look forward to, but that it would be the coming of God in judgment, which happens all throughout the Old Testament, where Yahweh says, I will come in judgment, and then what really happens is a military overthrow of a nation. I will judge this nation, I will come and judge this nation, and then really he brings another nation to overthrow that nation militarily. So that's the pattern of the Old Testament. And then so he would take, and I would agree, I really actually do agree with this, that when Jesus is talking about that, he's talking about his coming. So when he says this generation will not pass away, it literally means that generation would not pass away. And he's talking about the judgment of Jerusalem, and that would be bringing in the Roman army to overthrow Jerusalem, and that would be his own judgment on the unbelieving Jews. It's really interesting what happened in history that we know now, is that he said, the prophecy he gives there, he says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded, don't even go down into your house and get anything, just flee to the mountains, get out of Dodge. Mm-hmm. And it's a weird thought, like, well, if Jerusalem's surrounded, how do you get out of Dodge? Like, how do you leave? But what actually happened in history is that the Roman army surrounded Jerusalem to besiege it. All the Christians saw it.
This is so crazy.
And they're like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? Jesus said to get out of town. And then before they could really attack, they were called away. A scout messenger, someone came, said, you're needed somewhere else, much more important than this. So the army left, and they went and to go attack somewhere else. And so the Christians believed Jesus, and they left. The
Holy
Jews,
smokes.
the unbelieving Jews who did not believe Jesus, rejoiced and thought they'd won some great victory. And it was then the Romans came back, and they attacked the city, and it was a slaughter like had never happened before, and it was really terrible. So I think, so Jeff, I would say, is a, from what I've heard him teach, is a partial preterist, which is not, it still takes the second coming to be a real thing. Full preterism does not, and that's where there's some serious issues.
Okay, really just one more question.
Mm-hmm.
Geneva Pilgrim asks, and this person had some really great, and thank you guys for staying on topic in the chat. There's nothing worse than when you are really having fun in a live stream and you look down and everyone's like, well, my cat threw up, or talking about something totally not even related. So Geneva Pilgrim asks, let me get this open again, isn't it strange that Peter in Acts 10 still had never eaten anything unclean, even though it was 10 to 15 years after Jesus left, and yet Jesus had declared all foods clean?
I actually don't think it's strange at all.
A lot of, I mean,
yeah.
And there was a great chat about this too.
Yeah, I'm sure. So for what this can contribute, I don't think it's strange at all. The pattern we see in and I think that I honestly think Mike Winger, who is doing a series right now on Hebrew Roots movement, he had a live stream earlier this evening, but he's several episodes in. I think the last episode he did last week was on the book of Acts, or it might have been the week before. I think it was last week. And he points something out that I never noticed before, and that is how long the church was a Jewish thing before Gentiles ever even got involved.
They're still Jews.
Yeah, and there's not ever once, and it's important to know, is that there's not ever once any condemnation of a Jew for continuing to keep the Jewish customs and what was really law their whole lives for centuries and centuries and millennia really before Jesus comes. Why would we expect them to flip on a dime? And I would never expect that. I
don't know how to stop being an Idahoan.
Yeah. I don't. It's just who they are. It's who their culture has been for literally thousands of years at this point. So why would they change? And so, over 1,000 years, I guess. The thing I would point out is that it's not strange that they don't change, or that they've never, that he didn't start eating, unclean, what he saw as unclean, even if he knew that God changed it. We see several reasons why this could be the case. Number one is that for many years, it does take years before the Gentiles get involved, before Peter has his vision and goes to the Gentiles, goes to Cornelius and all that stuff happens. This is a ways down the road. So that's one thing, is a 100% Jewish community. Of course, they're just going to continue in what they've always done. Yeah. But then you have indications of change after that, where Paul says in 1 Corinthians, when he says that, I become, when I'm among the Jews, I behave like, or someone under the law, I behave like one under the law. But then even though I'm not under the law, and that's a great verse, if you're thinking about like, under the law means under the curse of the law, or the law of sin, or something like that. Well, he's talking about Jews. He's not talking about people under the law of curse or whatever. He's talking about Jews who are under the law. When I'm among those people, I behave as someone who is under the law, though I am not under the law. And he says
respect.
Yeah, and then when I'm with those who are without the law, the Gentiles, I behave as someone without law. But then he's very quick to say, not that I'm without law with regard to God, because I am under the law of Christ. So he's pointing out that, the law, I'm still under law, but I'm not under the law as it's always been. And I behave, and there's no indication from that text that he's talking about Jewish traditions that aren't in the Bible.
I find it ironic that this is the same Peter. Okay, God literally shows him in a vision these foods I have made clean, as a way of telling him, hey, we're going to take the gospel to the Gentiles now. The same Peter Paul later has to oppose to his face for not eating with the Gentiles.
Right.
That is so ironic. Peter.
Right. And that's the second passage I was going to bring up, because it's not just that we have Paul saying he sometimes behaves as one without law, so he behaves like a Gentile, doesn't keep everything exactly. but he when he chastises Peter, he doesn't say, just how dare you go eat with only these Jewish people. He says, you used to eat with the Gentiles. Mm-hmm. And he also says, how can you who behave as one not under the law try to, make other people behave as though they are under the law? So he
struggled with worrying what others think.
Yes.
I mean, this is why, when Jesus was on the cross, he was like, I don't know that guy.
Right. So Peter is obviously like
he's
Paul.
He's a rock, man.
Yeah. Peter's like Paul. He does things that aren't, that are like someone does who is not under the law. But then it wouldn't be hypocritical of Peter to try to get people to do things he does. It's only hypocritical to try to get people to do things he doesn't do, which means he wasn't fully keeping the law at this point.
He was just a little stressed about what his Jewish friends thought of him. Yeah,
exactly, and that was a big deal. So yeah, I think that it was a cultural okay thing to not necessarily keep the whole law, or to continue to keep it if someone wanted to. There was no condemnation in that either.
Ooh, lots more comments just floating.
So do we have any other things that are for sure
really.
for us?
Plop asks, who is HRM?
Oh.
I told him.
Okay.
Him or her, sorry.
Yeah.
Movement.
Okay.
Sorry for speaking jargon in the chat.
No problem. All right, well, it's been an awesome show. You guys have been
so
great.
Fun. Yeah.
And I'm just really excited for next week. I want to tell you guys actually right now. I've actually already got this lined up. We're going to have a Trinity-focused week next week because I'm doing an interview with Chris Date. If you keep up on anything Unitarian, if you know who Dale Tuggy is, Chris Date and Dale Tuggy had on the same day that this interview came out with Jeff and Andy, there was a debate between Dale Tuggy and Chris Date on the Trinity. I can't remember the actual title of the debate, but Chris Date's a Trinitarian who was debating against the Unitarian Dale Tuggy. He's going to be on the show next week, and we'll be talking about that debate and other stuff. It's going to be awesome. So God bless. Thank you guys so much for coming and being with us.
Tuesday.
Yeah, we'll see you next Tuesday. God bless.